In the book of Genesis, we come across Abraham and his nephew Lot. Both of them started on a journey, and it was actually Abraham who was called to go to the promised land, and he was accompanied by his nephew, and both of them they left from the Ur of the Chaldees. And Lot and Abraham, while they were traveling, in the meantime, their for their all their livestock increased, and during that time their people had a quarrel, which both Abraham and Lot wanted to avoid, and therefore they decided that they should separate and take up different lands to dwell in. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the plain of Jericho, Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, and that Jordan was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. This is mentioned in the book of Genesis, chapter 13. Then Lot himself, he chose to dwell in the plains of Jordan, and that is where both Lot and Abraham they separated from each other. Abraham, it says, is dwelt in that land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. Why do we take Sodom into account is the Lord has given a sign that what had happened in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah, that's what is going to happen in these end times. And therefore, both Lot and Abraham, they chose their own destinations. Abraham went to dwell in Canaan, and Lot in the plains of Jordan, where it was not far from Sodom and Gomorrah. And in this process, we find that both of them, they had their own livestock, their own people, and they grew and multiplied. But it is also said about Lot that he was a righteous man. In this book of 2 Peter 2 and 7, it says, God delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed with the filthy conduct of the wicked, for that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. This was in Sodom. And Lot, he dwelt in Sodom in the plains, and gradually he pitched his tent further inside Sodom. And there he married, and this righteous Lot, as his God has called him, he knew the Lord, and he grew up in that place. And at that time, Sodom and Gomorrah was a very wicked city. And we find that when the people were growing wickedly, at that time Sodom and his family, in Sodom, his family, they were also affected. And Lot, with his two daughters, his wife, they were also in that area. But what happened was there was failure in his life when God wanted to punish Sodom and Gomorrah. There were four steps which we will see towards his failure as a good husband, a good believer, and as a righteous man. And the first thing is we find the wrong perspective that developed in his life. The first step to his failure came when he was not in communion with God. And therefore he developed wrong perspective. The plains were well watered. The perspective of any Christian who is out of fellowship with the Lord is the same. He saw the plains, they were well watered, and it was good for agriculture, cultivation, and he could grow more in his wealth, and therefore he took up that particular aspect, but he never consulted. He was not in fellowship with God and fellowship with in Christian fellowship with the Lord. He developed some selfish attitude and he became more secular in his outlook and he was short sighted. This is usually what happens to people when we also do the same thing. When we lose our contact and fellowship with God, we enter into wrong perspective. And the second thing we find that Lot was flirting with the world. He moved his steps and his tents as far as Sodom, just in the wrong direction. He was not supposed to do it as a righteous man, and he was supposed to keep his ways, but he started flirting with the world. Flirting with the world, we understand that when you go around in the world and seek secular things, that's where you fall into temptations. And that is exactly what happened. His tents, he started pushing it into Sodom in the wrong direction. And that is where he was caught. He was caught unawares of all the secular principles of Sodom. And Sodom, as the name says, was such a wicked city that there the people were sexually abusive. That is where the name Sodomy comes from, this particular town, city of Sodom. And therefore, the city was so wicked that they landed up into all kinds of fleshly desires. And Lot became more secular because of flirting with the world. And that is what happens when we also do the same thing. We lose our spirituality. We become more short sighted and we enter into secular things. And the third thing we find that what happened to Lot was he was ensnared by the system. Sitting in the gate of Sodom, he didn't want to go out of it when God wanted to pour fire and brimstone. And the angels came and the angels took hold of him. And he said, "Now get out of this place because God is going to rain down fire and brimstone because Sodom's wickedness has reached to the heights." And there, Sodom did not want to move because it was so much deep into the system of Sodom and Gomorrah that he did not want to move out. And his wife was much deeper into it. And therefore, Lot was pulled out from that place and he was taken. He said, "Take me to Zoar, a place just outside of Sodom." And when he reached Zoar, the Lord rained heavily fire and brimstone. Because this is one of the signs of the end times. And that's why Jesus mentioned in the gospel as it was in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah. And this is what is going to happen in the end times. It took the angels and the fire from heaven to force him to go out from Sodom during the destruction of the city. It's mentioned in Genesis chapter 19, verses 15 onwards. And the fourth thing we find that happened to Lot was he lost everything. He lost his job, he lost his home, he lost his possessions, he lost his wife because his wife was told not to turn back while she was running out. And therefore, in Luke chapter 17, 21 verse 17 says, "And Lot's wife, she looked back." When she looked back, she was attracted by the secular things of Sodom that she could not move and became a pillar of salt. And that is where we find that he was able only to take his two daughters out of Sodom, but could not take Sodom out of their daughters. It so happens that when we are so much flirting with the world, when we are so much secular, losing our own spirituality, when we lose contact with God, we are ensnared by the system of the world, that is a time when we find ourselves totally, we are drifted and we are set aside, and that's what happened. We lose everything: our testimony, our fellowship, our goodwill with people, as well as we lose our job, our possessions, our life, and family. And that's exactly what happened to Lot. So, the four steps that made him to lose everything that he possessed and came back, yet he the Bible says he was righteous. And this righteous Lot, at the end, he was delivered from the destruction and he was saved of his life. And that is how it happened in the life of not only Lot, it can happen with any one of us if we lose sight of God and the spiritual life, the fellowship, and a bond and oneness with God. When we lose it, when we move in our own way, when we flirt, and when we lose our perspective, we develop wrong perspective, and when we lose sight of the spiritual things in our life, that is the time we find that we are lost in the world, but we can save our souls if we just be careful to move out from the way of destruction God has intended to send on the face of this earth.